Welcome to StorySeeker, exploring the world, one story at a time. Today, we listen together to Pride and Prejudice, the love story of Elizabeth Bennet and Fitzwilliam Darcy, where pride and prejudice meet, and love must overcome them all. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. However little known the feelings or views of such a man may be, on his first entering a neighborhood, this truth is so well fixed in the minds of the surrounding families that he is considered as the rightful property of some one or other of their daughters. "My dear Mr. Bennet," said his lady to him one day, "have you heard that Netherfield Park is let at last?" Mr. Bennet replied that he had not. "But it is," returned she, "for Mrs. Long has just been here, and she told me all about it." Mr. Bennet made no answer. "Do you not want to know who has taken it?" cried his wife impatiently. "You want to tell me, and I have no objection to hearing it." This was invitation enough. "Why, my dear? You must know, Mrs. Long says that Netherfield is taken by a young man of large fortune from the north of England, that he came down on Monday in a chaise and four to see the place, and was so much delighted with it that he agreed with Mr. Morris immediately. He is to take possession before Michaelmas, and some of his servants are to be in the house by the end of next week. What is his name? Bingley. Is he married or single? Oh, single, my dear, to be sure. A single man of large fortune, 4,000 or 5,000 a year. What a fine thing for our girls. How so? How can it affect them? My dear Mr. Bennet, replied his wife, how can you be so tiresome? You must know that I am thinking of his marrying one of them. Is that his design in settling here? Design? Nonsense. How can you talk so? But it is very likely that he may fall in love with one of them, and therefore you must visit him as soon as he comes. I see no occasion for that. You and the girls may go, or you may send them by themselves, which perhaps will be still better, for as you are as handsome as any of them, Mr. Bingley may like you the best of the party. My dear, you flatter me. I certainly have had my share of beauty, but I do not pretend to be anything extraordinary now. When a woman has 5 grown-up daughters, she ought to give over thinking of her own beauty. In such cases, a woman has not often much beauty to think of. But my dear, you must indeed go and see Mr. Bingley when he comes into the neighbourhood. It is more than I engage for, I assure you. But consider your daughters. Only think what an establishment it would be for one of them. Sir William and Lady Lucas are determined to go, merely on that account, for in general, you know, they visit no newcomers. Indeed, you must go, for it will be impossible for us to visit him if you do not. You are over-scrupulous, surely. I dare say, Mr. Bingley will be very glad to see you, and I will send a few lines by you to assure him of my hearty consent to his marrying whichever he chooses of the girls, though I must throw in a good word for my little Lizzie. I desire you will do no such thing. Lizzie is not a bit better than the others, and I am sure she is not half so handsome as Jane, nor half so good-humoured as Lydia, but you are always giving her the preference. They have none of them much to recommend them, replied he. They are all silly and ignorant like other girls, but Lizzie has something more of quickness than her sisters. Mr. Bennet, how can you abuse your own children in such a way? You take delight in vexing me. You have no compassion on my poor nerves. You mistake me, my dear. I have a high respect for your nerves. They are my old friends, I have heard you mention them with consideration these 20 years at least. Ah, you do not know what I suffer, but I hope you will get over it and live to see many young men of 4,000 a year come into the neighborhood. It will be no use to us if 20 such should come, since you will not visit them. Depend upon it, my dear, that when there are 20, I will visit them all. Mr. Bennet was so odd a mixture of quick parts, sarcastic humor, reserve, and caprice, that the experience of 23 years had been insufficient to make his wife understand his character. Her mind was less difficult to develop. She was a woman of mean understanding, little information, and uncertain temper. When she was discontented, she fancied herself nervous. The business of her life was to get her daughters married. Its solace was visiting and news. Mr. Bennet was among the earliest of those who waited on Mr. Bingley. He had always intended to visit him, though until the evening after the visit was paid, his wife did not know it. It was then disclosed in the following manner. Observing his second daughter employed in trimming a hat, he suddenly addressed her with, "I hope Mr. Bingley will like it, Lizzie." "We are not in a way to know what Mr. Bingley likes," said her mother resentfully, "since we are not to visit." "But you forget, Mamma," said Elizabeth, "that we shall meet him at the assemblies, and that Mrs. Long promised to introduce him." "I do not believe Mrs. Long will do any such thing. She has 2 nieces of her own. She is a selfish, hypocritical woman, and I have no opinion of her." "No more have I," said Mr. Bennet, "and I am glad to find that you do not depend on her serving you." Mrs. Bennet deigned not to make any reply, but, unable to contain herself, began scolding one of her daughters. "Don't keep coughing so, Kitty, for heaven's sake. Have a little compassion on my nerves. You tear them to pieces." "Kitty has no discretion in her coughs," said her father. "She times them ill." "I do not cough for my own amusement," replied Kitty fretfully. "When is your next ball to be, Lizzie?" "Tomorrow fortnight." "Aye, so it is," cried her mother. "And Mrs. Long does not come back till the day before, so it will be impossible for her to introduce him, for she will not know him herself." "Then, my dear, you may have the advantage of your friend, and introduce Mr. Bingley to her." She, "Impossible, Mr. Bennet, impossible, when I am not acquainted with him myself. How can you be so teasing?" "I honour your circumspection. A fortnight's acquaintance is certainly very little. One cannot know what a man really is by the end of a fortnight. But if we do not venture, somebody else will. And after all, Mrs. Long and her nieces must stand their chance, and, therefore, as she will think it an act of kindness, if you decline the office, I will take it on myself." The girls stared at their father. Mrs. Bennet said only, "Nonsense, nonsense. What can be the meaning of that emphatic exclamation?" cried he. "Do you consider the forms of introduction and the stress that is laid on them as nonsense? I cannot quite agree with you there. What say you, Mary? For you are a young lady of deep reflection, I know, and read great books and make extracts." Mary wished to say something sensible, but knew not how. "While Mary is adjusting her ideas," he continued, "let us return to Mr. Bingley." "I am sick of Mr. Bingley," cried his wife. "I am sorry to hear that. But why did you not tell me that before? If I had known as much this morning, I certainly would not have called on him. It is very unlucky, but as I have actually paid the visit, we cannot escape the acquaintance now." The astonishment of the ladies was just what he wished, that of Mrs. Bennet perhaps surpassing the rest, though when the first tumult of joy was over, she began to declare that it was what she had expected all the while. "How good it was in you, my dear Mr. Bennet, but I knew I should persuade you at last. I was sure you loved your girls too well to neglect such an acquaintance. Well, how pleased I am. And it is such a good joke too, that you should have gone this morning and never said a word about it till now. Now, Kitty, you may cough as much as you choose," said Mr. Bennet, and as he spoke, he left the room, fatigued with the raptures of his wife. "What an excellent father you have, girls," said she, when the door was shut. "I do not know how you will ever make him amends for his kindness, or me either, for that matter. At our time of life, it is not so pleasant, I can tell you, to be making new acquaintances every day. But for your sakes, we would do anything. Lydia, my love, though you are the youngest, I dare say Mr. Bingley will dance with you at the next ball." "Oh," said Lydia stoutly, "I am not afraid, for though I am the youngest, I'm the tallest." The rest of the evening was spent in conjecturing how soon he would return Mr. Bennet's visit, and determining when they should ask him to dinner. Not all that Mrs. Bennet, however, with the assistance of her 5 daughters, could ask on the subject was sufficient to draw from her husband any satisfactory description of Mr. Bingley. They attacked him in various ways with barefaced questions, ingenious suppositions, and distant surmises, but he eluded the skill of them all, and they were at last obliged to accept the second-hand intelligence of their neighbour, Lady Lucas. Her report was highly favourable. Sir William had been delighted with him. He was quite young, wonderfully handsome, extremely agreeable, and, to crown the whole, he meant to be at the next assembly with a large party. Nothing could be more delightful. To be fond of dancing was a certain step towards falling in love, and very lively hopes of Mr. Bingley's heart were entertained. "If I can but see one of my daughters happily settled at Netherfield," said Mrs. Bennet to her husband, "and all the others equally well married, I shall have nothing to wish for." In a few days, Mr. Bingley returned Mr. Bennet's visit, and sat about 10 minutes with him in his library. He had entertained hopes of being admitted to a sight of the young ladies, of whose beauty he had heard much. But he saw only the father. The ladies were somewhat more fortunate, for they had the advantage of ascertaining from an upper window that he wore a blue coat and rode a black horse. An invitation to dinner was soon afterwards dispatched, and already had Mrs. Bennet planned the courses that were to do credit to her housekeeping, when an answer arrived which deferred it all. Mr. Bingley was obliged to be in town the following day, and, consequently, unable to accept the honour of their invitation, etc. Mrs. Bennet was quite disconcerted. She could not imagine what business he could have in town so soon after his arrival in Hertfordshire, and she began to fear that he might always be flying about from one place to another, and never settled at Netherfield as he ought to be. Lady Lucas quieted her fears a little by starting the idea of his being gone to London only to get a large party for the ball, and a report soon followed that Mr. Bingley was to bring 12 ladies and 7 gentlemen with him to the assembly. The girls grieved over such a number of ladies, but were comforted the day before the ball by hearing that instead of 12, he brought only 6 with him from London, his 5 sisters and a cousin. And when the party entered the assembly room, it consisted of only 5 altogether: Mr. Bingley, his 2 sisters, the husband of the eldest, and another young man. Mr. Bingley was good-looking and gentlemanlike. He had a pleasant countenance and easy, unaffected manners. His sisters were fine women, with an air of decided fashion. His brother-in-law, Mr. Hurst, merely looked the gentleman, but his friend, Mr. Darcy, soon drew the attention of the room by his fine, tall person, handsome features, noble mien, and the report which was in general circulation within 5 minutes after his entrance, of his having 10,000 a year. The gentleman pronounced him to be a fine figure of a man. The ladies declared he was much handsomer than Mr. Bingley, and he was looked at with great admiration for about half the evening, till his manners gave a disgust which turned the tide of his popularity, for he was discovered to be proud, to be above his company, and above being pleased, and not all his large estate in Derbyshire could then save him from having a most forbidding, disagreeable countenance, and being unworthy to be compared with his friend. Mr. Bingley had soon made himself acquainted with all the principal people in the room. He was lively and unreserved, danced every dance, was angry that the ball closed so early, and talked of giving one himself at Netherfield. Such amiable qualities must speak for themselves. What a contrast between him and his friend. Mr. Darcy danced only once with Mrs. Hurst, and once with Miss Bingley, declined being introduced to any other lady, and spent the rest of the evening in walking about the room, speaking occasionally to one of his own party. His character was decided. He was the proudest, most disagreeable man in the world, and everybody hoped that he would never come there again. Amongst the most violent against him was Mrs. Bennet, whose dislike of his general behaviour was sharpened into particular resentment by his having slighted one of her daughters. Elizabeth Bennet had been obliged, by the scarcity of gentlemen, to sit down for 2 dances, and during part of that time, Mr. Darcy had been standing near enough for her to hear a conversation between him and Mr. Bingley, who came from the dance for a few minutes, to press his friend to join it. "Come, Darcy," said he, "I must have you dance. I hate to see you standing about by yourself in this stupid manner. You had much better dance." "I certainly shall not. You know how I detest it, unless I am particularly acquainted with my partner. At such an assembly as this, it would be insupportable. Your sisters are engaged, and there is not another woman in the room whom it would not be a punishment to me to stand up with." "I would not be so fastidious as you are," cried Bingley, "for a kingdom. Upon my honour, I never met with so many pleasant girls in my life as I have this evening. All of them, you see, uncommonly pretty. You are dancing with the only handsome girl in the room," said Mr. Darcy, looking at the eldest Miss Bennet. "Oh, she is the most beautiful creature I ever beheld. But there is one of her sisters sitting down just behind you, who is very pretty, and I dare say very agreeable. Do let me ask my partner to introduce you." "Which do you mean?" And turning round, he looked for a moment at Elizabeth, till catching her eye, he withdrew his own and coldly said, "She is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me, and I am in no humour at present to give consequence to young ladies who are slighted by other men. You had better return to your partner and enjoy her smiles, for you are wasting your time with me." Mr. Bingley followed his advice. Mr. Darcy walked off, and Elizabeth remained with no very cordial feelings toward him. She told the story, however, with great spirit among her friends, for she had a lively, playful disposition, which delighted in anything ridiculous. When Jane and Elizabeth were alone, the former, who had been cautious in her praise of Mr. Bingley before, expressed to her sister just how much she admired him. "He is just what a young man ought to be," said she. "Sensible, good-humoured, lively. Never saw such happy manners, so much ease, with such perfect good breeding." "He is also handsome," replied Elizabeth, "which a young man ought likewise to be, if he possibly can. His character is thereby complete." "I was very much flattered by his asking me to dance a second time. I did not expect such a compliment. Did not you? I did for you, but that is one great difference between us. Compliments always take you by surprise, and me never. What could be more natural than his asking you again? He could not help seeing that you were about 5 times as pretty as every other woman in the room. No thanks to his gallantry for that. Well, he certainly is very agreeable, and I give you leave to like him. You have liked many a stupider person." "Dear Lizzie, oh, you are a great deal too apt, you know, to like people in general. You never see a fault in anybody. All the world are good and agreeable in your eyes. I never heard you speak ill of a human being in your life. I would not wish to be hasty in censuring anyone, but I always speak what I think. I know you do, and it is that which makes the wonder, with your good sense, to be so honestly blind to the follies and nonsense of others. Affectation of candour is common enough. One meets it everywhere, but to be candid without ostentation or design, to take the good of everybody's character and make it still better, and say nothing of the bad, belongs to you alone. And so you like this man's sisters too, do you? Their manners are not equal to his. Certainly not at first. They are very pleasing women when you converse with them. Miss Bingley is to live with her brother and keep his house, and I am much mistaken if we shall not find a very charming neighbour in her." Elizabeth listened in silence, but was not convinced. Their behaviour at the assembly had not been calculated to please in general, and with more quickness of observation and less pliancy of temper than her sister, and with a judgment too unassailed by any attention to herself, she was very little disposed to approve them. They were in fact very fine ladies, not deficient in good humour when they were pleased, nor in the power of making themselves agreeable when they chose it, but proud and conceited. They were rather handsome, had been educated in one of the first private seminaries in town, had a fortune of £20,000, were in the habit of spending more than they ought, and of associating with people of rank, and were therefore in every respect entitled to think well of themselves and meanly of others. They were of a respectable family in the north of England, a circumstance more deeply impressed on their memories than that their brother's fortune and their own had been acquired by trade. Mr. Bingley inherited property to the amount of nearly £100,000 from his father, who had intended to purchase an estate, but did not live to do it. Mr. Bingley intended it likewise, and sometimes made choice of his county. But as he was now provided with a good house and the liberty of a manor, it was doubtful to many of those who best knew the easiness of his temper, whether he might not spend the remainder of his days at Netherfield and leave the next generation to purchase. His sisters were anxious for his having an estate of his own, but, Though he was now only established as a tenant, Miss Bingley was by no means unwilling to preside at his table, nor was Mrs. Hurst, who had married a man of more fashion than fortune, less disposed to consider his house as her home when it suited her. Mr. Bingley had not been of age 2 years when he was tempted by an accidental recommendation to look at Netherfield House. He went to see it and was so much pleased with it that he took it immediately. Between him and Darcy there was a very steady friendship, in spite of great opposition of character. Bingley was endeared to Darcy by the easiness, openness, and ductility of his temper, though no disposition could offer a greater contrast to his own, and though with his own he never appeared dissatisfied. On the strength of Darcy's regard, Bingley had the firmest reliance, and of his judgment the highest opinion. In understanding, Darcy was the superior. Bingley was by no means deficient, but Darcy was clever. He was at the same time haughty, reserved, and fastidious, and his manners, though well-bred, were not inviting. In that respect, his friend had greatly the advantage. Bingley was sure of being liked wherever he appeared. Darcy was continually giving offence. The manner in which they spoke of the Meryton assembly was sufficiently characteristic. Bingley had never met with more pleasant people or prettier girls in his life. Everybody had been most kind and attentive to him. There had been no formality, no stiffness. He had soon felt acquainted with all the room, and, as to Miss Bennet, he could not conceive an angel more beautiful. Darcy, on the contrary, had seen a collection of people in whom there was little beauty and no fashion, for none of whom he had felt the smallest interest, and from none received either attention or pleasure. Miss Bennet he acknowledged to be pretty, but she smiled too much. Mrs. Hurst and her sister allowed it to be so, but still they admired her and liked her, and pronounced her to be a sweet girl, and one whom they would not object to know more of. Miss Bennet was therefore established as a sweet girl, and their brother felt authorized by such commendation to think of her as he chose. Within a short walk of Longbourn lived a family with whom the Bennets were particularly intimate. Sir William Lucas had been formerly in trade in Meryton, where he had made a tolerable fortune and risen to the honour of knighthood by an address to the king during his mayoralty. The distinction had perhaps been felt too strongly. It had given him a disgust to his business and to his residence in a small market town, and, in quitting them both, he had removed with his family to a house about a mile from Meryton, denominated from that period Lucas Lodge, where he could think with pleasure of his own importance, and, unshackled by business, occupy himself solely in being civil to all the world. For, though elated by his rank, it did not render him supercilious. On the contrary, he was all attention to everybody. By nature inoffensive, friendly, and obliging, his presentation at Street James's had made him courteous. Lady Lucas was a very good kind of woman, not too clever to be a valuable neighbour to Mrs. Bennet. They had several children. The eldest of them, a sensible, intelligent young woman, about 27, was Elizabeth's intimate friend. That the Miss Lucases and the Miss Bennets should meet to talk over a ball was absolutely necessary, and the morning after the assembly brought the former to Longbourn to hear and to communicate. "You began the evening well, Charlotte," said Mrs. Bennet with civil self-command to Miss Lucas. "You were Mr. Bingley's first choice." "Yes, but he seemed to like his second better." Oh, you mean Jane, I suppose, because he danced with her twice. To be sure, that did seem as if he admired her indeed. I rather believe he did. I heard something about it, but I hardly know what something about Mr. Robinson. Perhaps you mean what I overheard between him and Mr. Robinson. Did not I mention it to you? Mr. Robinson's asking him how he liked our Meryton assemblies, and whether he did not think there were a great many pretty women in the room, and which he thought the prettiest, and his answering immediately to the last question, "Oh, the eldest Miss Bennet. Beyond a doubt, there cannot be two opinions on that point." Upon my word, well, that is very decided indeed. That does seem as if, but, however, it may all come to nothing, you know. My overhearings were more to the purpose than yours, Eliza, said Charlotte. Mr. Darcy is not so well worth listening to as his friend, is he? Poor Eliza, to be only just tolerable. I beg you would not put it into Lizzie's head to be vexed by his ill treatment, for he is such a disagreeable man that it would be quite a misfortune to be liked by him. Mrs. Long told me last night that he sat close to her for half an hour without once opening his lips. Are you quite sure, ma'am? Is not there a little mistake? Said Jane. I certainly saw Mr. Darcy speaking to her. Aye, because she asked him at last how he liked Netherfield, and he could not help answering her. But she said he seemed very angry at being spoken to. Miss Bingley told me, said Jane, that he never speaks much, unless among his intimate acquaintances. With them he is remarkably agreeable. I do not believe a word of it, my dear. If he had been so very agreeable, he would have talked to Mrs. Long, but I can guess how it was. Everybody says that he is eat up with pride, and I dare say he had heard somehow that Mrs. Long does not keep a carriage, and had come to the ball in a hack chaise. I do not mind his not talking to Mrs. Long, said Miss Lucas, but I wish he had danced with Eliza. Another time, Lizzie, said her mother. I would not dance with him, if I were you. I believe, ma'am, I may safely promise you never to dance with him. His pride, said Miss Lucas, does not offend me so much as pride often does, because there is an excuse for it. One cannot wonder that so very fine a young man, with family, fortune, everything in his favour, should think highly of himself. If I may so express it, he has a right to be proud. That is very true, replied Elizabeth, and I could easily forgive his pride if he had not mortified mine. Pride, observed Mary, who piqued herself upon the solidity of her reflections, is a very common failing, I believe. By all that I have ever read, I am convinced that it is very common indeed, that human nature is particularly prone to it, and that there are very few of us who do not cherish a feeling of self-complacency on the score of some quality or other, real or imaginary. Vanity and pride are different things, though the words are often used synonymously. A person may be proud without being vain. Pride relates more to our opinion of ourselves. Vanity to what we would have others think of us. If I were as rich as Mr. Darcy, cried a young Lucas who came with his sisters, I should not care how proud I was. I would keep a pack of foxhounds and drink a bottle of wine every day. Then you would drink a great deal more than you ought, said Mrs. Bennet, and if I were to see you at it, I should take away your bottle directly. The boy protested that she should not. She continued to declare that she would, and the argument ended only with the visit. The ladies of Longbourn soon began to visit Netherfield, and it was not long before Jane was asked to dine there. Mrs. Bennet, whose plans for Jane's marriage to Mr. Bingley were proceeding nicely, was thrilled by the invitation. When a heavy rain fell the next morning, soaking Jane on her ride to Netherfield, she was forced to remain at the estate due to illness. Mrs. Bennet, quite pleased, refused to send the carriage to retrieve her daughter, hoping she might extend her stay. Elizabeth, concerned for Jane's health, walked the 3 miles to Netherfield to visit her sister. Her arrival caused quite a stir. Her appearance, muddy and windblown, offended Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst. Mr. Bingley, however, was delighted by her devotion to Jane. Mr. Darcy also observed Elizabeth with interest, though he struggled with his growing admiration. Miss Bingley made every effort to amuse Darcy and to mock Elizabeth's country manners. Her disdain, however, only increased Darcy's appreciation for Elizabeth's intelligence and lively wit. Elizabeth noticed Darcy's attentions, but remained skeptical of his character. Charlotte Lucas, meanwhile, shared her views on Jane's situation with Elizabeth. She was not a romantic, and believed that Jane, if she truly hoped to win Bingley's heart, should show more obvious affection. If a woman conceals her affection with the same skill from the object of it, Charlotte warned, she may lose the opportunity to secure him. Elizabeth disagreed. She believed Jane's modesty and sincerity were virtues, not flaws. She thought Charlotte too practical, too eager for security to see the importance of genuine feeling. During Jane's extended stay at Netherfield, Elizabeth's presence became more frequent. The contrast between Elizabeth's lively mind and Miss Bingley's flatteries became increasingly clear to Mr. Darcy. He found himself appreciating Elizabeth's candour, despite her lower social rank. Miss Bingley, aware of Darcy's interest, grew jealous. Her attempts to mock Elizabeth only revealed her own insecurity. One evening, as Elizabeth read aloud, Miss Bingley walked around the room to draw Darcy's attention, but he remained focused on Elizabeth. Darcy admired Elizabeth's fine eyes and quick wit, though he tried to resist the attraction. He reminded himself of her family's lack of wealth and refinement, which made her unsuitable as a match. But reason and pride could not control his heart. Meanwhile, Mr. Bingley's attentions to Jane became more open and consistent. He admired her beauty and kindness, and his sisters, though less enthusiastic, could not deny Jane's charm. Yet they remained cautious, concerned that Jane's connections were too humble. Back at Longbourn, Mrs. Bennet grew ever more convinced that a proposal was imminent. Elizabeth remained watchful but supportive, wanting Jane's happiness above all. Charlotte's warning continued to echo in her mind. Happiness in marriage is entirely a matter of chance. Elizabeth rejected that view, but the world around her seemed determined to test it. As Jane recovered and returned home, her thoughts were full of Bingley. Elizabeth, however, saw the dangers ahead, both from others and from the illusions of one's own heart. Thus, the seeds of affection, confusion, and pride were planted, setting the course for both heartache and unexpected joy. Mr. Bennet's property consisted almost entirely in an estate of £2,000 a year, which, unfortunately for his daughters, was entailed in default of heirs male. on a distant relation, and their mother's fortune, though ample for her situation in life, could but ill supply the deficiency of his. His principal business was to be in the library, and he was content to let his wife manage the affairs of the house and the prospects of their 5 daughters. The younger girls, Catherine and Lydia, were particularly frequent visitors to their aunt, Mrs. Phillips, in Meryton. Through her, they often heard gossip and news of the officers quartered there with the militia regiment. Lydia, especially, was giddy, full of spirits, and obsessed with the red coats and flirtations. It was during one of these visits to Meryton that the girls were introduced to Mr. Denny, an officer who had recently transferred into the regiment. He, in turn, introduced them to Mr. George Wickham, a handsome and charming man in the regiment. Wickham's easy manners and good looks made an immediate impression, especially on Elizabeth. He seemed the perfect gentleman, respectful, gallant, and sociable. Even Mrs. Phillips was enchanted, and she quickly invited the officers to dinner. That same evening, Jane received another invitation from Miss Bingley to dine at Netherfield. Elizabeth encouraged her to go, but this time, Jane travelled in a carriage to avoid another unintended overnight stay. The weather remained clear, and the visit passed without incident. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's curiosity about Wickham grew. She was surprised to find, at a public gathering, that Darcy and Wickham knew each other, but their brief exchange was marked by cold civility and clear discomfort. Elizabeth immediately sensed a history between them. Later, in private conversation, Wickham alluded to a past grievance. He hinted that Darcy had once wronged him, speaking bitterly, but carefully. Elizabeth, already prejudiced against Darcy due to his pride at the assembly, found Wickham's story both believable and disturbing. Wickham claimed that he had grown up with Darcy at Pemberley, and that Darcy had denied him a living promised by Mr. Darcy's late father. Elizabeth was indignant on Wickham's behalf and shared the story with Jane. Jane, ever fair and generous, cautioned her not to judge without knowing both sides. Despite Jane's warnings, Elizabeth's opinion of Darcy sank even lower. Wickham's charm and humility contrasted sharply with Darcy's aloofness. Elizabeth believed she had found the truth, and another reason to despise the proud Mr. Darcy. Back at Longbourn, Mrs. Bennet continued to boast of Jane's prospects with Mr. Bingley and encouraged Lydia's flirtations with the officers. Elizabeth, more thoughtful, began to observe the dangerous vanity and unchecked impulses in her younger sisters. But for the moment, all eyes and hearts were turned toward Meryton, where gossip, admiration, and first impressions laid the groundwork for deepening attachment and eventual heartbreak. Thus, the Bennet family, each member driven by different desires and understandings, began to move down paths shaped by misunderstanding, pride, and the hidden truths of character. At Netherfield, Jane remained convalescing under the care of Mr. Bingley's sisters. Elizabeth, having walked to visit her, was now staying to attend to Jane's recovery. Though concerned for her sister, Elizabeth observed with growing amusement the social dynamics at play. Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst, while superficially polite, were clearly unimpressed with Elizabeth's informal manners and country background. Elizabeth, for her part, bore their condescension with wit and composure, unconcerned by their snobbery. Mr. Darcy, however, continued to be intrigued. Despite himself, he found Elizabeth's lively mind and frankness compelling, yet he remained stiff, holding to his pride and the social gulf between them. During one evening, the group gathered in the drawing room. Elizabeth took up a book, and Miss Bingley attempted to draw Darcy's attention by ridiculing Elizabeth's preference for reading and independence. "How shall we punish her?" said Miss Bingley playfully, "for such a willful preference for reading? When she is grown up, I dare say she will be a great reader and give herself airs." Darcy did not respond with the enthusiasm Miss Bingley hoped for. Instead, he praised Elizabeth's quickness of observation and elegance of mind, causing a visible flash of jealousy in Miss Bingley. Later that night, as the conversation turned to the accomplishments of women, Miss Bingley described the ideal. A woman must possess a thorough knowledge of music, singing, drawing, dancing, and modern languages, and above all, she must have a certain something in her air and manner of walking. "I am no longer surprised at your knowing only 6 accomplished women," said Elizabeth. "I rather wonder now at your knowing any." Darcy, unmoved, replied that such rare accomplishments must be the result of diligent application. Miss Bingley tried again to regain Darcy's attention, commenting flatteringly on his letter writing and handwriting. Darcy admitted he took pride in the correctness and style of his correspondence. Elizabeth teased him for vanity, which only amused him more. The tension between Darcy and Elizabeth deepened. Though he fought his attraction, Darcy found Elizabeth's wit and courage stimulating. Elizabeth, meanwhile, continued to find him proud, yet increasingly difficult to ignore. When Jane's health improved enough to return to Longbourn, Elizabeth prepared to accompany her home. Mr. Bingley expressed genuine concern and regret at her leaving, while Miss Bingley masked her relief behind formal civility. The visit to Netherfield had left its mark on all. Jane returned with a tender, growing affection for Bingley. Elizabeth carried back sharpened observations about character and class, and Darcy, despite his better judgment, left more entangled than ever in thoughts of a woman he could neither admire too little nor forget. Thus the story moved forward one of misread hearts, clashing pride, and the first glimmers of something deeper. Elizabeth had been at Netherfield long enough. Jane was recovering, though not yet strong. Mr. Bingley and his sisters insisted she stay longer, but Elizabeth judged it best to return home. Mrs. Bennet, however, sent word that Jane should not be moved until entirely recovered. Elizabeth remained, attending her sister and observing her hosts. On the 3rd morning, as Elizabeth was sitting with Jane, a servant entered to say that her mother had come. Bennet, accompanied by Lydia and Kitty, soon swept into the room, full of bustling energy and endless chatter. Her noisy presence, so different from the subdued atmosphere of Netherfield, embarrassed Elizabeth deeply. Mr. Bingley received her with civility and kindness. Mrs. Bennet, never one to miss an opportunity, praised Jane's beauty and accomplishments in front of him, and continued with various boasts about the family's connections and expectations. Her loud conversation and coarse remarks did not escape Miss Bingley's notice, nor Darcy's silent disapproval. Lydia, ever bold, asked after the officers in Meryton, spoke loudly about Mr. Denny and Mr. Wickham, and even joked that she hoped Mr. Bingley would host a ball at Netherfield soon. Mrs. Bennet supported this suggestion and practically demanded it. Elizabeth's mortification grew. Her family's lack of refinement, their forwardness and imprudence, contrasted painfully with the composure and elegance of the Bingley household. She caught a glimpse of Darcy's expression, a restrained disdain she could not fault. When Mrs. Bennet finally departed, Elizabeth apologized privately to Jane. Had they behaved in even the slightest way like gentlewomen, she said, I might have endured it better. Later that day, Elizabeth encountered Darcy alone in the library. Their conversation was civil but stiff. Darcy could not help but admire her manners, though her family's conduct cast a shadow in his mind. Meanwhile, Bingley, unaffected by the morning's chaos, remained openly attached to Jane. His manners were unaffected, and his delight in Jane's company obvious. His sisters, though courteous, still viewed Jane with silent judgment. When Elizabeth and Jane finally returned to Longbourn, Elizabeth felt relief. She loved her family dearly, but saw with painful clarity the effect their behaviour might have on Jane's prospects. As for Darcy, he returned to his own rooms with a mind filled with conflicting thoughts. Elizabeth had impressed him again, but her relations had not. Thus, the early threads of admiration and pride twisted tighter, while prejudice took deeper root. The day after Jane and Elizabeth returned to Longbourn, a letter arrived from Netherfield. It was addressed to Jane from Miss Bingley, full of polite expressions of concern for her health, and a brief mention that the Netherfield party would not return to Meryton for some days, having gone to town. Jane, though disappointed, tried to conceal her feelings. Elizabeth, however, sensed her sister's growing anxiety and suspected that Miss Bingley was not being entirely forthright. Elizabeth's judgment of Miss Bingley had not improved. She believed the woman's warmth was artificial, her intentions self-serving. Meanwhile, Mrs. Bennet's attention turned once again to Mr. Bingley and the ball he had supposedly promised. But no word came. Though Jane hoped quietly, her mother speculated loudly and often. In the days that followed, the Bennet household resumed its usual rhythm. Elizabeth walked frequently to Meryton, where she often encountered Mr. Wickham. His easy manner, handsome face, and shared disdain for Mr. Darcy drew Elizabeth closer. She listened eagerly when he expanded upon their past. According to Wickham, Darcy had deliberately deprived him of the church living left to him by Darcy's father. The story he told painted Darcy as arrogant, envious, and cruel. Elizabeth, already inclined to believe ill of Darcy, accepted Wickham's account without question. Jane, though concerned by her sister's partiality, remained cautious in judgment. She continued to defend Darcy, or at least withhold condemnation. Elizabeth admired her sister's goodness, but felt it blinded her. One evening, as they dined with the Lucases, Charlotte observed Elizabeth and Wickham with interest. She liked Elizabeth, but feared her affections might grow too fast. Charlotte's own views on marriage remained practical. Happiness in marriage is entirely a matter of chance, she had said once before, and she meant it. Mr. Collins had arrived earlier that week at Longbourn, a clergyman and the Bennet family's heir. He was pompous, overly formal, and self-important. He spoke often of his patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, and made frequent references to her grandeur and benevolence. At dinner, Mr. Collins announced that he had come with the intention of choosing a Bennet daughter for a wife as a peace offering for the entail of Longbourn. Though his manner was absurd, Mrs. Bennet was thrilled. Elizabeth, however, found his conversation intolerable. He praised himself endlessly, quoted Lady Catherine as gospel, and lacked any real understanding of social grace. He quickly singled out Jane. But when told she might soon be engaged, he turned his attention to Elizabeth. Though mortified by his presumptuousness, Elizabeth remained composed. Jane, meanwhile, grew more downcast with each passing day, as no further letters arrived from Netherfield. Thus, between unspoken affections, mistaken characters, and an ever-growing web of misunderstandings, the dance of pride and prejudice continued to unfold, step by faltering step. The next evening, the Netherfield party returned. Bingley's sisters came to visit the Bennets, and their civility, though strained, pleased Mrs. Bennet. Jane's spirits lifted. Elizabeth, however, remained wary of Miss Bingley's intentions. Shortly after, Mr. Collins made his intentions clear. He proposed to Elizabeth in a long-winded and pompous manner, beginning with praise of Lady Catherine, then explaining his reasons for marrying, and finally assuring Elizabeth of her good fortune in receiving his offer. Elizabeth, astonished and repelled, refused him with firm politeness. Mr. Collins, assuming she was playing coy, insisted she must accept. He argued that all modest young ladies decline proposals at first, and that her family's situation made her acceptance practical, even necessary. "I am perfectly serious in my refusal," Elizabeth said, standing her ground. Still, Mr. Collins would not yield. Not until Mrs. Bennet intervened with outrage, and Mr. Bennet, with quiet firmness, supported Elizabeth's choice, did Mr. Collins finally abandon his suit. "Marry Mr. Collins," said Mrs. Bennet. "I shall never speak to you again." But Mr. Bennet, smiling slightly, said, "An unhappy alternative is before you, Elizabeth. From this day, you must be a stranger to one of your parents. Your mother will never see you again if you do not marry Mr. Collins, and I will never see you again if you do." Elizabeth's relief was immense. She escaped the room, her nerves shaken but her resolution intact. In the aftermath, Mr. Collins shifted his attention to Charlotte Lucas. Within days, and to everyone's surprise, especially Elizabeth's, he proposed to Charlotte, and she accepted. Elizabeth was stunned. She could not comprehend why her intelligent, sensible friend would marry such a man. Charlotte explained her reasoning plainly. At 27, with few prospects, she saw Mr. Collins as a secure match. His profession, income, and connection to Lady Catherine offered stability and respectability. "I am not romantic, you know," she said. "I ask only a comfortable home." Though Elizabeth could not admire her decision, she respected Charlotte's honesty. The engagement created a rift between their sensibilities, but not their affection. Soon after, Charlotte left to prepare for her new life at Hunsford. The Bennet household, meanwhile, returned to gossip and speculation. Jane still heard nothing from Netherfield, and Elizabeth's distrust of Miss Bingley deepened. In those weeks, the world grew more complicated. Love, ambition, and security pulled people in opposite directions, and Elizabeth, who had always trusted her instincts, began to question what she truly understood about character and happiness. As the time drew near for Jane's visit to Netherfield to end, Elizabeth grew more uneasy. Her sister had received no further indication from Mr. Bingley or his sisters that a deeper connection would follow. Though Jane hoped and believed in the sincerity of Bingley's affection, Elizabeth was less certain. The Bennet sisters left Netherfield, escorted by Mr. Bingley, who showed the same kindness and attentiveness he always had. Yet Elizabeth saw with clarity that his sisters were no longer invested in promoting the match. Miss Bingley, in particular, had grown distant. Back at Longbourn, the household returned to its usual distractions. Mr. Collins departed for Hunsford, and the excitement of Charlotte's engagement faded into routine correspondence. One morning, a letter arrived from Miss Bingley addressed to Jane. It was written in polished, formal language and included news that the entire Netherfield party had returned to London. More painfully, it suggested that Mr. Bingley was growing closer to Miss Georgiana Darcy, and that Miss Bingley looked forward to calling her sister. Jane tried to hide her disappointment, but Elizabeth could see her distress. Though Jane defended Miss Bingley's intentions, Elizabeth saw the truth. The letter was calculated to discourage her. Elizabeth assured her sister that Bingley would never act so coldly on his own, and suspected that Darcy and Miss Bingley had engineered the separation. "I am not afraid," Elizabeth said. "He will be back. He loves you. This is their doing, not his." Jane smiled, but her heart was not convinced. She bore her sorrow quietly, without complaint, retreating often into her thoughts. The rest of the winter passed with little change. Elizabeth kept close watch over Jane's spirits, growing more resentful toward those she believed responsible for her sister's unhappiness. By the end of January, Charlotte Lucas invited Elizabeth to visit her at Hunsford in March. Though Elizabeth hesitated, still troubled by Charlotte's marriage to Mr. Collins, she agreed. She hoped to understand her friend's new life and escape the confines of Longbourn. Thus, the Bennet household slipped into the calm before new revelations. Hearts bruised, but not broken, futures uncertain, and a spring visit that would stir everything once more. The stage was quietly resetting for the next turn of Pride and the slow unveiling of Prejudice. March arrived, and with it, Elizabeth's journey to Hunsford. She travelled with Sir William and Maria Lucas, Charlotte's younger sister. The carriage ride was long, but Elizabeth welcomed the change of scene. Her spirits were lifted by the idea of visiting her old friend, even if that friend was now the wife of Mr. Collins. Upon arriving at the parsonage, Elizabeth was struck by Charlotte's composure. Though the home was small and plainly furnished, it was neat, orderly, and comfortable. Mr. Collins beamed with pride as he gave a full tour, praising Lady Catherine's generosity at every turn. "Her ladyship has condescended to recommend even the pattern for the curtains," he said, gesturing toward the parlour windows. Charlotte, calm and resigned, played the role of contented wife with quiet dignity. Elizabeth could see her friend had accepted her situation and made peace with it. Still, Elizabeth found Mr. Collins's pompous speeches and obsession with his patroness as comical as ever. The days passed with routine predictability. Mr. Collins read aloud from Fordyce's sermons in the evenings, and Charlotte skillfully managed their time to give Elizabeth some escape from his company. Elizabeth was grateful for the walks and conversations with Charlotte, though she remained perplexed by her friend's decision to marry such a man. A highlight of the visit was their first invitation to dine at Rosings Park. the grand estate of Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Mr. Collins was beside himself with anticipation and rehearsed appropriate compliments. When the evening came, the ladies dressed carefully and walked the short distance to Rosings. The house was imposing, richly decorated, and filled with the symbols of aristocratic wealth. Lady Catherine, a tall, commanding woman with a sharp voice and formidable presence, received them in a grand drawing room. Lady Catherine questioned Elizabeth with condescension, inquiring about her upbringing, education, and accomplishments. "What is your age? Are any of your sisters out in society? Do you draw? Play the pianoforte? Read French?" Elizabeth answered politely but without flattery. When asked if she had been properly taught, Elizabeth replied, "We were always encouraged to read, and we had a music master for a short time, but we never had the advantages of a governess." Lady Catherine was scandalized. "No governess? 5 daughters brought up at home without a governess? This is very strange." Elizabeth remained composed. She found Lady Catherine's arrogance amusing, though she kept her wit in check. After dinner, Lady Catherine played the piano poorly and offered unsolicited advice. She scolded Maria Lucas for her shyness and instructed Elizabeth on how to improve her playing, though Elizabeth had not played at all. Mr. Collins, meanwhile, was in awe of everything Lady Catherine said or did. He whispered his admiration frequently and thanked her for the honor of every small attention. As the evening ended, Elizabeth reflected on the encounter. Lady Catherine, though wealthy and titled, had little true grace. Her opinions were law in her own domain, but Elizabeth saw clearly the limits of her insight. Returning to the parsonage, Elizabeth felt a renewed sense of independence. The evening had shown her more of the world and affirmed her own judgment in facing it. The day after their visit to Rosings, Mr. Collins could talk of nothing but Lady Catherine. Every conversation at the parsonage returned to her generosity, her affability, her taste in furniture, and the many compliments she had paid him. Elizabeth bore it patiently, though with growing amusement. Charlotte, more practiced, managed to redirect his speeches or occupy him with household matters. Yet Elizabeth could see how Charlotte balanced her peace of mind with strategic silence. 2 days later, while the ladies were enjoying a walk, a new visitor arrived at the parsonage. Mr. Darcy, accompanied by his cousin, Colonel Fitzwilliam. Their appearance surprised Elizabeth greatly. Darcy greeted her with his usual reserve, while the Colonel was more open and easy in manner. Mr. Collins was once again overwhelmed by the honor of receiving such distinguished guests. He arranged the best refreshments, spoke effusively of Lady Catherine, and insisted on showing them the entire garden. To Elizabeth's astonishment, Darcy stayed longer than courtesy required. Though he said little, he observed her attentively, asking after her family and her sister Jane with unexpected interest. In the following days, Mr. Darcy and Colonel Fitzwilliam visited the parsonage frequently. The Colonel's friendly conversations made Elizabeth feel at ease. Darcy, however, remained enigmatic. He often came alone and sat in silence, only occasionally offering a question or comment. Elizabeth began to suspect that his visits were not solely out of obligation, yet she could not reconcile this attention with the Darcy. She believed she knew the proud man who had separated Jane from Bingley and wronged Mr. Wickham. One morning, Walking to the parsonage alone, Darcy entered and found Elizabeth reading. Their conversation was awkward at first, but when Elizabeth mentioned that she had recently received letters from Jane, Darcy seemed genuinely pleased. "You will not find Miss Bennet again at Netherfield," he said with gravity. Elizabeth's heart sank at his words, yet she kept her composure. "She is well and has many friends in London." He looked at her, and there was a moment of silence. Then he left abruptly, without explanation. Elizabeth turned the encounter over in her mind. Why had he come? Why had he stayed? She could not find answers. The mystery of Mr. Darcy grew deeper, and with it, the quiet tension between them began to thrum louder beneath the surface of their meetings. Thus, the stage was quietly being set for one of the most surprising declarations Elizabeth would ever hear. The time passed at Hunsford with regularity. Elizabeth settled into the quiet routine of the parsonage, alternating between walks with Charlotte, conversations with Colonel Fitzwilliam, and puzzling visits from Mr. Darcy. The weather grew mild, and spring infused the countryside with bloom. One morning, as Elizabeth strolled alone in the park near Rosings, she unexpectedly encountered Colonel Fitzwilliam. He joined her for a walk, and they spoke freely. The Colonel was amiable and intelligent, with a lightness of manner that made him easy company. He spoke of his family and his role as the younger son. "I cannot afford to marry without some attention to money," he said with candor, as they wandered through shaded paths. Elizabeth nodded, understanding more than she said. Then, casually, he mentioned that Darcy had recently saved a close friend from an unsuitable match. "He told me it was a most imprudent engagement," Fitzwilliam added. "His friend would have been ruined." Elizabeth felt her breath catch. She knew at once he spoke of Bingley and Jane. Her cheeks flushed with anger. Darcy had interfered. He had torn her sister's happiness away. Elizabeth struggled to maintain composure for the remainder of their walk, then excused herself and returned to the parsonage. Her thoughts raced. The image she had constructed of Darcy as arrogant but redeemable now darkened into something colder. The next day, Darcy came to call. He seemed more agitated than usual, pacing, speaking little. Charlotte and Maria soon left the room, and Darcy approached Elizabeth. He began suddenly, without preamble. "In vain have I struggled. It will not do. My feelings will not be repressed. You must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you." Elizabeth stared at him in disbelief. He continued, speaking of his long fight against his affection, of her inferior connections, of every obstacle he had tried to overcome. It was a confession of love and an insult. She refused him immediately. Her refusal was calm but firm. "You chose to tell me you liked me against your will, against your reason. I could forgive your pride if you had not mortified mine." Darcy was stunned. "Could you expect me to rejoice in the inferiority of your connections?" Elizabeth grew more animated. She accused him of cruelty to Jane and dishonesty with Wickham. "You ruined, perhaps forever, the happiness of a most beloved sister," she said. Darcy's composure broke. He asked, incredulous, if she truly believed Wickham's story. "Yes," she replied. "Mr. Wickham is everything a gentleman should be." They parted with cold civility. Darcy's pride had been wounded. Elizabeth's sense of injustice burned fiercely. When she was alone, however, Her anger gave way to unease. Could she be wrong? Was her judgment flawed? And so the proposal that should have sealed a romance became instead a fracture, a clash of pride, pain, and prejudice too deep to be quickly healed. The morning after Mr. Darcy's proposal, Elizabeth awoke with a heavy heart. Sleep had brought no peace, and her thoughts churned with confusion and indignation. As she dressed, a knock came at her door. It was a servant bearing a letter in Mr. Darcy's handwriting. She took it, hesitated, then broke the seal. It was dated from the previous evening. He began by acknowledging her refusal and the bitterness of her accusations. "Be not alarmed, madam, by the contents," he wrote. "Let me do justice to my character." He addressed first the charge regarding Jane and Mr. Bingley. Darcy admitted that he had indeed discouraged the match. He believed Jane's affections were not deeply engaged and feared that the Bennet family's behaviour might harm his friend's happiness. He had acted, he claimed, out of concern. Elizabeth's eyes burned as she read. So he had separated them, not through malice, but conviction. Next, Darcy turned to the matter of Mr. Wickham. The tone shifted, wounded pride, tempered by painful honesty. Wickham, Darcy revealed, was the son of his father's steward. He had been left a generous living in Mr. Darcy's father's will. But instead of taking orders, Wickham demanded a cash settlement and squandered the funds. Later, he returned, hoping to elope with Darcy's young sister, Georgiana, to secure her fortune. Elizabeth's heart sank. The story was detailed and sincere. She reread the letter twice, her emotions torn. Shame crept over her. She had been blinded by Wickham's charm and Darcy's hauteur. Her prejudice, she now saw, had led her astray. That afternoon, she walked alone in the groves of Rosings, reflecting on everything. She could not excuse Darcy's pride, nor the pain caused to Jane, but she saw now the honesty in his words and the courage in his confession. Her pride had been just as strong as his. She had judged without knowledge, believed flattery, and dismissed sincerity. It was a humbling realization. As the days passed, Elizabeth became quieter, more thoughtful. She avoided the company of Mr. Darcy, though he did not seek her out again. Colonel Fitzwilliam noticed her silence, but said nothing. When the time came to leave Hunsford, Elizabeth said goodbye to Charlotte with sincere affection. She had come with questions, and she left with truths painful, necessary truths that would change her forever. As she returned to Longbourn, she carried with her the letter that had shattered her certainty and planted something new in its place: understanding and the first seeds of self-knowledge. Elizabeth arrived home at Longbourn with a changed heart and mind. Though the countryside looked as it had when she left, her perspective had shifted entirely. The familiar sights of her family's home now carried new weight, coloured by the truths revealed in Darcy's letter. Her reception was lively. Lydia and Kitty launched into chatter about recent Meryton gossip. Mrs. Bennet was all complaints and schemes. Mr. Bennet welcomed her with dry wit and questions about her visit. But Elizabeth's thoughts remained inward. She observed her family's follies with new eyes. Her mother's obsession with marriage and her father's sarcastic detachment no longer amused her. She saw how Jane's quiet dignity had been misunderstood and how dangerously ill-judged Lydia's impulsive nature was. The presence of the militia in Meryton continued to stir excitement among the younger Bennet girls. Lydia, in particular, grew ever more forward in her flirtations, emboldened by her mother's indulgence. Elizabeth could hardly tolerate Wickham's presence now that she knew the truth. His easy manner and charming lies still held sway over others, but to her, they rang hollow. She avoided him as best she could. One afternoon, as she and Jane walked in the garden, Elizabeth shared the essence of Darcy's letter. She told Jane about Darcy's role in Bingley's withdrawal, explaining that it had been done out of genuine concern, not cruelty. Jane was deeply moved, but would not allow herself to dwell in bitterness. "I am sure," Jane said, "that Mr. Darcy believed he was doing what was right. He thought I was indifferent." Elizabeth admired her sister's grace. She also revealed the truth about Wickham's past. Jane, though surprised, took the news with her usual evenness, feeling more sorrow than anger. The sisters agreed to keep the revelations private. Elizabeth especially felt that Darcy's confidence in her must be honoured. As the spring advanced, Mr. Bennet received a letter from Mr. Collins, congratulating them on Elizabeth's safe return and inviting her and her family to visit Rosings again. The letter also included vague praise for Lady Catherine's condescension and Charlotte's excellent domestic management. Elizabeth declined with civility. Her time at Hunsford had changed her too much to return so soon. Meanwhile, Lydia received an invitation to accompany the Forsters to Brighton, where the regiment would soon be stationed. Mrs. Bennet was delighted, and Lydia was ecstatic. Elizabeth, however, was alarmed. She urged her father to prevent the trip. "Lydia will never be easy until she has exposed herself in some public place," she warned. "For her own sake, and for our families, she should not go." Mr. Bennet laughed it off. "Lydia will never be easy till she has run away with a soldier," he joked. "She is silly and headstrong. Let her go and enjoy herself." Elizabeth was distressed. She saw the danger clearly now. Unchecked vanity, selfish indulgence, and blind indulgence from her parents. So the season turned towards summer, with trouble gathering quietly on the horizon. Elizabeth, wiser and warier, felt both gratitude and regret for what she had learned, and for what she feared might still come. With Lydia's departure to Brighton fast approaching, Elizabeth grew more anxious. She watched her younger sister boast of the trip with gleeful ignorance, oblivious to the impropriety of her behaviour. Elizabeth's unease deepened each day, and still her father refused to intervene. Before Lydia's journey began, Elizabeth received an invitation from her aunt and uncle, the Gardeners, to join them on a summer tour of the countryside. Their plans were modest, but Elizabeth welcomed the escape. Jane was to spend time in London with the Gardeners' children, while Elizabeth would accompany Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner through parts of Derbyshire. As the day of Lydia's departure arrived, the Bennet household bustled with excitement. Mrs. Bennet was in high spirits, convinced that Lydia would return engaged. Elizabeth, however, could barely conceal her dread. "You will laugh when I tell you where I'm going," Lydia said cheerfully. "I am going to Brighton, and I shall flirt with at least 6 officers before I come home." She departed with Mrs. Forster, leaving behind a quiet unease that Elizabeth could not shake. Soon after, Elizabeth left Longbourn with the Gardeners. Their tour took them north through Oxford, Blenheim, and onward through the Midlands. The countryside revived her spirits, and she was glad for the thoughtful company of her aunt and uncle. Their journey eventually brought them within reach of Derbyshire. Mrs. Gardiner, having grown up near Lambton, proposed a visit. Elizabeth agreed, especially when she learned they might stop to see Pemberley, Mr. Darcy's estate. At first, she hesitated. The thought of seeing Pemberley stirred memories and conflicting emotions, but she was reassured that Darcy was away, and curiosity overcame hesitation. When they arrived, the grandeur of the estate took Elizabeth's breath away. The house stood on a gentle rise, surrounded by woodlands and water. As they toured the elegant rooms, Elizabeth felt a strange sense of awe and regret. In one gallery, she paused before a portrait of Darcy. It was striking, proud, composed, yet noble. The housekeeper, speaking kindly of her master, said he was generous, fair, and greatly beloved by his staff. Elizabeth listened, her heart shifting with every word. This was not the man she thought she knew. The contrast between her former opinion and this new evidence was stark and humbling. As they walked through the gardens, she felt more conflicted than ever. Then, unexpectedly, Darcy appeared. He was returning a day early. Their eyes met in mutual astonishment. Darcy, though surprised, greeted her with gentleness. His manner had changed. He was no longer aloof, but gracious, reserved, and respectful. Elizabeth blushed, unsure how to respond. Her aunt and uncle soon joined them, and Darcy remained polite and attentive to all. He walked with them, spoke warmly, and invited them to dine at Pemberley the next day. As they departed, Elizabeth was overwhelmed. Everything about Darcy's demeanor had shifted. He seemed a man transformed, and she, too, was changing, unraveling her pride, opening her heart, and discovering that the truths of character are not always visible at first glance. The following morning, Elizabeth awoke with a sense of nervous anticipation. She could not stop thinking of Mr. Darcy's changed manner and the way he had looked at her at Pemberley. The invitation to dine had been unexpected, and her thoughts danced uneasily between anxiety and curiosity. The Gardeners, equally surprised by Darcy's attentions, remarked favourably upon his politeness and generosity. "He is not at all what I expected," said Mrs. Gardiner, "so gentlemanlike and unassuming." Elizabeth could only agree, though her heart still beat with uncertainty. Had his affections revived? Was he offering friendship only? She could not be sure. That afternoon, they returned to Pemberley as invited. They were received warmly by Miss Darcy, a shy and graceful girl of 15 or 16. Elizabeth was struck by her sweetness and timidity, and it became clear that she admired her brother deeply. Darcy, though quieter than usual, made every effort to encourage his sister's comfort. He introduced Elizabeth to Georgiana with particular warmth, and Elizabeth felt both honoured and humbled by his regard. Miss Bingley and Mr. Hurst were also visiting, and Elizabeth noted Miss Bingley's watchful displeasure. She attempted to belittle Elizabeth, but Darcy paid no attention to her jabs. Instead, his attention remained on Elizabeth, respectful, interested, and steady. During the visit, Mr. Gardiner and Darcy discussed fishing and estate management, discovering shared interests. Elizabeth observed them with satisfaction. Her uncle, she thought, was a respectable man of sense and character, and Darcy seemed to value him sincerely. When the visit ended, Darcy accompanied the Gardiners and Elizabeth to their carriage. As he handed Elizabeth in, his eyes met hers with quiet intensity. There was no declaration, but something in his expression spoke volumes. That night, Elizabeth could not sleep. She turned over every word and gesture, her heart no longer settled. Darcy's transformation was real, his regard unchanged, and her own feelings were beginning to follow a path she had once thought impossible. The next day, Elizabeth and the Gardiners planned a short excursion from Lambton, but were delayed. Just after breakfast, a letter arrived for Elizabeth in Jane's handwriting. She opened it with a smile, but as she read, the smile vanished. The letter bore news that struck her like a blow. Lydia had run away from Brighton. Worse still, she had eloped with Wickham, and there was no certainty they were married. Elizabeth gasped and turned pale. She read the letter twice, then handed it to her aunt without a word. Panic seized her. She could barely think. Wickham's true nature, the warnings Darcy had given, Lydia's recklessness, it all converged into one devastating truth. They must return home at once. Elizabeth informed Mr. Darcy of the situation as he arrived at the inn. His concern was immediate and genuine. He offered help, but she declined, with tears in her eyes. "I must go home," she said. "My family needs me." Darcy looked at her with a gravity she would never forget. "Let me know if there is anything I can do," and then he was gone. Elizabeth left Lambton with a heart in turmoil. Her joy and hopes had been crushed beneath the weight of family disgrace, and now, the man she had begun to love might be lost forever. She could think of nothing but Lydia and Wickham. The journey back to Longbourn was anxious and silent. Elizabeth sat beside her aunt, her thoughts consumed by Lydia's folly and Wickham's treachery. At every mile, her fears deepened. What would they find at home? Would Lydia be discovered or ruined forever? When they arrived, they were met by Jane, whose pale face and tired eyes told of sleepless nights. She embraced Elizabeth tightly. "She is not found," Jane whispered. "No word yet. Papa is in London, searching with Uncle Gardiner. We fear the worst." Inside, Mrs. Bennet was inconsolable. She wept loudly, declaring that Lydia was as good as dead and that the family was ruined. "And all for a red coat," she wailed. "Oh, my poor nerves." Mr. Bennet's absence left a vacuum. Mary moralized, Kitty cried, and Elizabeth, trying to remain strong, offered what comfort she could. In quiet moments with Jane, Elizabeth confessed all Darcy's warning, Wickham's past, and the letter. Jane was shocked, but understanding. She shared Elizabeth's pain and her resolve to hope. Days passed with no news. Letters from Mr. Bennet were brief and disheartening. He had found no trace of the couple. Elizabeth blamed herself. She had known the truth and said nothing. Had she exposed Wickham earlier, might this have been prevented? The thought tormented her. One morning, a letter arrived from Mr. Gardiner. It announced that the couple had been found. Wickham and Lydia were in London, but they were not yet married. Mr. Gardiner wrote that a marriage had been arranged. Wickham had agreed, but only with financial inducement. The details were vague, but Elizabeth sensed that her uncle had offered a substantial sum. Lydia would return home respectably married, but at what cost? Mr. Bennet returned shortly after. He was subdued, ashamed of his failure to act sooner. "I should have listened to you, Lizzie," he said. "I have been a careless father." Lydia's return was set, and though the household prepared, there was little joy. Elizabeth's thoughts turned again to Mr. Darcy. Had he heard? What must he think of them now? She longed to see him again, but feared that Lydia's disgrace had erased any regard he once held. As the house braced itself for Lydia's homecoming, Elizabeth wondered, could love survive scandal? And what price must be paid for foolish pride? Lydia arrived at Longbourn with the triumphant air of someone returning from a celebration, not a scandal. She swept into the house, smiling and chattering as if nothing had happened. "My dear family," she cried, "you must all congratulate me. I am a married woman." She wore her wedding ring like a trophy, oblivious to the shame her elopement had caused. Her mother, delighted beyond reason, embraced her with joy. Her father, silent and grim, barely acknowledged her. Wickham followed, still handsome and composed. He behaved with enough propriety to ease the discomfort of the meeting, but Elizabeth watched him closely, the truth of his character clear to her now. Over the next few days, Lydia regaled her sisters with tales of Brighton and her marriage, showing no understanding of the damage she had done. Elizabeth tried to speak to her in private, hoping to learn more of how the marriage had been arranged. "I suppose," Elizabeth asked, "you must have seen Darcy in London?" Lydia laughed. "Oh, yes. He was at our wedding. But you must not tell anyone. I promised him I wouldn't say a word. He did it all, you know." Elizabeth's breath caught. "Darcy? He arranged your marriage?" But Lydia said no more. She skipped off, leaving Elizabeth stunned. Mr. Darcy had done this, had sought them out, had made the arrangements, had likely paid Wickham's debts, and saved their family from disgrace. Elizabeth's feelings overwhelmed her. Gratitude, admiration, disbelief, it all surged within her. Why had he done it? Was it for her? The question lingered as Lydia and Wickham departed for the north. With their absence came a strange stillness. The crisis had passed, but the consequences remained. Elizabeth longed to speak to Darcy, to thank him, to understand, and quietly, in the chambers of her heart, something resolute began to grow. She did not know when she would see him again, but she hoped, more than ever. The morning after Jane's engagement, the Bennet household was alive with joy. Mrs. Bennet bustled from room to room, imagining wedding dresses and settlements, while Jane bore the attention with graceful modesty. Elizabeth, though thrilled for her sister, remained quiet and thoughtful. She longed to see Mr. Darcy again, to speak with him, thank him, and perhaps, if courage allowed, tell him more. Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy soon called at Longbourn once more. As they entered, Elizabeth felt her heart beat faster. Darcy's eyes met hers, and though few words passed between them, something unspoken lingered. Later that week, while walking alone through the lanes near Longbourn, Elizabeth heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw Mr. Darcy approaching. They walked in silence for a while. Then, with evident effort, Darcy spoke. "You must allow me to thank you for your generous praise," he said, referring to her earlier words about his role in Lydia's marriage. "If you knew what I felt, but I cannot presume." Elizabeth stopped. "You are too generous to trifle with me," she said softly. "If your feelings are the same as before, I must tell you, they are no longer unwelcome." Darcy's expression changed. "You are too good to me," he said, and in that moment, all past misunderstandings fell away. They walked on, speaking openly at last. Darcy confessed his struggle, his pride, his fears, and how her rejection had changed him. Elizabeth shared her transformation too, her realization of her own prejudice and her growing admiration. When they returned to Longbourn, their secret was not yet revealed. But Elizabeth's smile was brighter, her eyes lighter. Jane soon guessed the truth and was overjoyed. The days that followed were filled with quiet happiness. Mr. Darcy sought Mr. Bennet's permission and was accepted, albeit with some surprise. "Are you lost to every feeling of propriety and delicacy?" Mr. Bennet had asked Elizabeth in private. "No, Papa," she said, smiling. "I do love him. He is truly the best man I have ever known." And so, it was settled. The proud, distant gentleman who had once been scorned now walked beside the spirited, sharp-witted woman who had once refused him. They had both changed, and they had found their way together. News of the engagements, first Jane's to Mr. Bingley, then Elizabeth's to Mr. Darcy, spread quickly. Mrs. Bennet could hardly contain herself. She boasted to anyone who would listen that she would soon have 2 daughters married to men of fortune. "My dearest Lizzie, how rich and how great you will be," she cried. "What pin money, what jewels, what carriages you will have." Elizabeth bore her mother's enthusiasm with patience, but she smiled inwardly at how little her mother understood Mr. Darcy. Wealth and grandeur were not the source of her happiness, it was the man himself. Mr. Bennet, though more composed, was deeply moved. He pulled Elizabeth aside one evening and said, "I could not have parted with you to anyone less worthy." The 2 sisters shared quiet moments together, reflecting on their journeys. "If I had not been so blinded by vanity," Elizabeth said, "I might have understood him sooner. And I," said Jane, "might have believed in his love more freely." Preparations began for 2 weddings, and the house filled with activity. Letters arrived from London, offering congratulations, and the Lucases, Phillipses, and even Lady Lucas made frequent visits. Lady Catherine, however, had not forgotten her earlier confrontation with Elizabeth. She arrived at Longbourn one morning, unannounced, to voice her indignation. "You are to be married to my nephew." "It must not be," she declared. "You are inferior, your family, your connections utterly beneath him." Elizabeth listened, composed. "He is a gentleman," she replied. "I am a gentleman's daughter. We are equals." Lady Catherine left in fury, and the encounter, rather than discouraging Mr. Darcy, confirmed to him Elizabeth's strength and resolve. He returned to Longbourn soon after, more in love than ever. When Elizabeth and Darcy walked together that afternoon, she asked if Lady Catherine's visit had influenced him. "It taught me," he said, "how wrong I was to doubt that you could ever care for me. Your answer to her gave me hope, and with that, their future was secured." The double wedding took place with modest elegance. Jane and Bingley soon moved to an estate near Derbyshire, while Elizabeth and Darcy made Pemberley their home. Though Mrs. Bennet continued to speak of wealth and status, Elizabeth never forgot what truly mattered: understanding, growth, and love hard-earned. The proud had been humbled, the prejudiced had learned to see, and in that, they found happiness that would last all their lives. As the newlyweds settled into their lives, the differences between the households of Pemberley and Netherfield began to show. Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy found peace in the quiet majesty of Derbyshire, while Jane and Bingley embraced the cheerful warmth of a smaller estate. Elizabeth quickly endeared herself to the Pemberley staff, not through grandeur or demand, but through her kindness and good sense. She adapted gracefully to her role as mistress of the great house. Her wit remained, tempered now by deeper reflection. Darcy admired her all the more for it. The couple often entertained visitors, including Georgiana Darcy, who grew close to Elizabeth and flourished under her sister-in-law's warmth and guidance. Georgiana's reserved nature softened, and she often sought Elizabeth's advice, especially on matters of reading, music, and society. Letters arrived frequently from Longbourn. Mrs. Bennet's health had never been better, owing to her delight in boasting about her daughter's fine marriages. Kitty, once drawn into Lydia's careless orbit, now benefited from Jane and Elizabeth's examples. With time and distance from bad influence, her manners improved remarkably. Mary remained at home, more devoted to her books and sermons than ever. Though unchanged in her solemnity, she found solace in being considered the most accomplished of those remaining at Longbourn. Lydia, however, continued to write only when she needed money. Her life with Wickham was unstable and lacking in both propriety and peace. Wickham's career remained uncertain, his debts mounting, and their marriage offered little contentment. Elizabeth occasionally helped, though she did so quietly and only with Darcy's support. Lady Catherine de Bourgh did not write, nor visit. Her pride was wounded too deeply, but Mr. Collins, ever reverent, sent yearly letters to Pemberley, praising the Darcys' condescension and hinting at his own domestic felicity. Elizabeth and Darcy, through all this, remained true companions. They talked often, walked together daily, and shared the triumphs and challenges of estate life as equals. Disagreements came and went, but always with understanding and affection. Mr. Bennet visited often, especially in winter, enjoying the quiet study at Pemberley far more than the noise of Longbourn. He and Elizabeth shared long, thoughtful conversations by the fire. As the seasons turned, Pemberley became more than a home. It became a place of transformation, forgiveness, and lasting love. And though their story began with misunderstanding, it ended with perfect clarity. Theirs was a union not just of affection, but of character, respect, and growth. A love tested and true, a pride overcome, and every prejudice left behind. Thank you for strolling through today's stories with StorySeeker. If you also love classic literature, fairy tales, and endless adventures. Please subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any journey. See you in the next story. Wishing you all the best.